From the Weather Channel, a special presentation. Weather disasters kill hundreds of Americans every year. Property losses reach into the billions. In spite of modern technology, more accurate forecasts, instant communication, the threat of disaster hangs over our lives. Hurricanes, tornadoes, flash floods strike quickly and are gone, leaving us with shattered lives and with a new sense of our own vulnerability. Now, 5 great weather disasters.
Atlantic hurricanes come in cycles. For decades, there may be very few, or they may all hit the Gulf Coast states. Then there'll be decades of great activity and huge storms, and they may all hit the Atlantic coast. So someone who's lived on the coast for years may have seen only the benign side of the cycle. When the killer side finally shows itself, residents are in for an ugly surprise.
Well, during the whole decade of the 50s, we had this cycle where most hurricanes that affected the United States affected somewhere on the East Coast. And this is actually the only decade, you might say, of the whole 20th century where it has been that marked. We had 3 major hurricanes that year. In addition to Hazel, in 1954, we had Edna and Carol. And then in 1955, we had the twin hurricanes there that we hear a lot about, Connie and Diane, that did a lot of flooding in the Carolinas. Well, Hazel was a very devastating storm. We had not really seen anything like it in North Carolina, I don't think, before we had Hurricane Hugo anyway in 1989. And it was very devastating in that it took just about everything off the beaches of North Carolina and even a bit of South Carolina. There was a stretch of 170 miles, for example, where every pier was demolished. And in that same area, just about every beachfront house was destroyed.
Hurricane Hazel developed just east of the Windward Islands on October 5th, 1954. It grew in strength and size, moved west and then north, and hit Haiti on the 12th. An estimated 400 to 1,000 people died. Then the storm moved north toward the U.S. mainland with incredible forward speed. On the 14th, Hazel was just east of Miami. By the morning of the 15th, Hazel was hammering North Carolina. It was a Category 4 on the Saffir-Simpson scale. Leila Piggott lived in this house in Southport, North Carolina in 1954, right across the street from the yacht basin. She and her husband had operated shrimp boats and a processing plant in Southport for 13 years. But Mrs. Piggott had never seen a hurricane like Hazel. 40 years later, and still in the same house, she's a much wiser woman today.
When I really got really upset about this storm was the night of October the 14th. It just got terrible. It was continuous and it just got worse and worse. Anyway, I lay in bed. My husband went to sleep. He couldn't have cared less, I think. But I listened to the radio and listened to the bulletins. And this was all new to me. I had never listened to anything like this before. And they frightened me, but I believed them because my house was shaking. It was blowing so terrific. I was awake all night long, pacing the floor, crying, praying, wondering what was going to happen. I really thought maybe we were all going to die.
Leila Piggott's own film of Hazel. Her husband went out into the storm to try to save their 5 shrimp boats moored just across the street.
Now, why he was taking that chance, I don't know. But he was not the only one. Other owners of boats were doing the same thing. I guess in a case like that, when your whole life is at stake, everything you've worked for all your life is going, you will go the length. But anyway, last time he went, the only building down there, a sea shifted it and caught his foot between a piling and that building. I couldn't see him. I lost sight of him because he was underwater. And of course I died when I couldn't see him. And then all of a sudden I saw him and he swam and I watched him. He told me what happened. He said, I won't go again. And I said, well, thank God. And he didn't leave me again.
As Hazel moved through Southport, the winds shifted.
It got to the sterns of all those dozens and dozens of boats. And they went everywhere, in the marsh, up in the woods, over in people's yards, knocking houses down, tearing up cars, anything they hit. It was disastrous.
Back in the 50s, a lot of the shrimpers and fishermen that time, they didn't have a lot of wealth. They didn't have insurance, for example, on their equipment or their boats. And many of them lost their livelihoods with Hurricane Hazel. Many of their boats were wrecked. A lot of the fishing piers, docks, packing houses, and so forth were just completely trashed by the storm surge that swept up the coast.
Jay Barnes is director of the North Carolina Aquarium and author of North Carolina's Hurricanes.
Well, most of the damage was focused on the Brunswick County beaches, where we had, again, about a 17, 18-foot storm surge. And many of those beaches were just completely swept clean. The cottages that were built there, most of them were not built up on pilings like they are today. The sand dunes were leveled, and many people who went back to find their cottages after the storm were surprised that there was nothing left but just a clean, empty beach. I do think that the geography of North Carolina puts us at great risk for hurricanes. Our coastline extends out into the Atlantic, particularly the Outer Banks. We have very large sounds, Pamlico Sound and Albemarle Sound and others that back up these barrier islands. And just a tremendous amount of exposure that our state faces puts us at risk for future hurricanes as well.
Hazel killed 20 people on the Carolina coast. Estimated damage in the Carolinas, $136 million. And the storm would not relent. It raced across North Carolina, struck West Virginia, the western suburbs of Washington, D.C., then spun across Pennsylvania and New York and crashed into Ontario.
I'm sure they were astonished, and I don't think anybody was prepared for the speed of movement of this hurricane. Now, a lot of times late in the season, we see that hurricanes do move pretty fast when they turn toward the north. But this hurricane, from the time it made landfall, right near the North Carolina, South Carolina border on up into Pennsylvania and up into Canada. Part of that time it was moving in excess of 60 miles per hour.
The ground in the Toronto area was already saturated from earlier rains, and when Hazel approached Canada, the storm got some reinforcements.
Actually, there was a low-pressure system in the upper atmosphere that had been moving eastward through Canada, and the hurricane and that upper low sort of combined, and the energy of the two complemented each other and made it the hurricane actually worse, very likely, by the time it got up into Canada than it had been just before it got there.
Hazel hit Toronto with 50-mile-an-hour winds and 8 inches of rain. 78 people died in flash floods.
In Toronto, it was more devastating than any other hurricane that I know about. Now, Canada does indeed get the tail end of hurricanes out in the Canadian Maritime provinces. A lot of these hurricanes that go up to the East Coast are still very powerful hurricanes when they get up to Nova Scotia and to Newfoundland. But to have a hurricane be devastating that far west, back as far as Toronto, that's the most powerful one I've seen there, I believe.
Hurricane Hazel was full of surprises. In 24 hours, it went from a Category 2 off the coast of Miami to a Category 4 in North Carolina. It tore through the United States at 60 miles per hour, dumped 10 inches of rain in parts of the Appalachians, and then hit an unsuspecting population in Toronto with the strongest hurricane they're ever likely to experience. In Southport, North Carolina, they're still talking about it.
And I really didn't know whether this house was going to stand the storm or not. I didn't know in any minute the whole house would blow away. And of course, I thought of the fact that we may lose everything. But I was sitting here in all this anguish, seeing my entire life change. But it's something I will never forget. Nobody that was here that day and night will ever forget that storm. It was a nightmare.